Good Economics for Hard Times by Abhijeet Banerjee and Esther Duflo. Preface. 10 years ago, we wrote a book about the work we do. To our surprise, it found an audience. We were flattered, but it was clear to us that we were done. Economists do not really write books. Least of all books human beings can read. We did it and somehow got away with it. It was time to go back to what we normally do, which is to write and publish research papers. Which is what we were doing while the light drawn of the early Obama years gave way to the psychedelic madness of Brexit, the yellow vests and the wall, and strutting dictators, or their elected equivalents, replaced the confused optimism of the Arab Spring. Inequality is exploding. Environmental catastrophes and global disasters loom, but we are left with little more than platitudes to confront them. We wrote this book to hold on to hope, to tell ourselves the story of what went wrong and why, but also as a reminder of all the things that has gone right. A book as much about the problems as about how our world can be put back together, as long as we are honest with the diagnosis. A book about where economic policy has failed, where ideology has blinded us, where we have missed the obvious, but also a book about where and why good economics is useful, especially in today's world. The fact that such a book needs to be written does not mean we are the right people to write it. Many of the issues plaguing the world right now are particularly salient in the rich North, whereas we have spent our lives studying poor people in poor countries. It was obvious that we would have to immerse ourselves in many new literatures, and there was always a chance we would miss something. It took us a while to convince ourselves it was even worth trying. We eventually decided to take the plunge, partly because we got tired of watching at a distance while the public conversation about core economic issues immigration, trade, growth, inequality, or the environment goes more and more off kilter. But also because, as we thought about it, we realized the problems facing the rich countries in the world were actually often eerily familiar to those we are used to studying in the developing world. People left behind by development, ballooning inequality, lack of faith in government, fractured societies and polity, and so on. We learned a lot in the process, and it did give us faith in what we as economists have learned best to do, which is to be hard headed about the facts, skeptical of slick answers and magic bullets, modest and honest about what we know and understand, and perhaps most importantly, willing to try ideas and solutions and be wrong, as long as it takes us towards the ultimate goal of building a more humane world. Chapter 1. Make Economics Great Again. A woman hears from her doctor that she has only half a year to live. The doctor advises her to marry an economist and move to the South Dakota. Woman: will this cure my illness? Doctor: no, but half the year will seem pretty long. We live in an age of growing polarization, from Hungary to India, from the Philippines to the United States, from the United Kingdom to Brazil, from Indonesia to Italy. The public conversation between the left and the right has turned more and more into a high decibel slanging match, where harsh words used wantonly leave very little scope for backtracking. In the United States, where we live and work, split ticket voting is at its lowest record. 81% of those who identify with one party have negative opinion of the other party. 61% of Democrats say they view Republicans as racists, sexists, or bigots. 54% of the Republicans call Democrats spiteful. A third of all Americans would be disappointed if a close family member married someone from the other side. In France and India, The other two countries where we spend a lot of time, the rise of the political right is discussed in the liberal, enlightened, elite world we inhabit in increasingly millenarial terms. There is clear feeling that civilizations as we know it, based on the democracy and debate, is under threat. As social scientists, our job is to offer facts and interpretation of facts we hope will mediate the divides, help each side understand what the other is saying, and thereby arrive at some reasoned disagreement, if not a consensus. Democracy can live with dissent as long as there is respect on both sides. But respect demands some understanding. What makes the current situation particularly worrying is that the space for such conversations seem to be shrinking. There seems to be a tribalization of views, not just about politics, but also about what the main social problems are and what to do about them. A large scale survey about found Americans' views on a broad spectrum of issues come together like a bunch of grapes. People who share some core beliefs, say about gender roles or whether hard work always leads to success, seem to have the same opinions on a range of issues from immigration to trade, from inequality to taxes, to the role of the government. These core beliefs are better predictors of their policy views than their income, their demographic groups, or where they live. These issues are in some ways front and center in the political discourse, and not just in the United States. Immigration, trade, taxes, and the role of government are just as contested in Europe, India, South Africa, or Vietnam. But views on these issues are all too often based entirely on the affirmation of specific personal values. I am for immigration because I am a generous person. I am against immigration because migrants threaten our identity as a nation. And when they are bolstered by anything, it is by made up numbers and very simplistic readings of the facts. Nobody really thinks very hard about the issues themselves. This is really quite disastrous because we seem to have fallen on hard times. The go go years of global growth, fed by trade expansion and China's amazing economic success, may be over. What with China's growth slowing and trade wars igniting everywhere? Countries that prospered from the rising tide in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are beginning to wonder what is next for them. Of course, in most countries in the affluent West, slow growth is nothing new at this point. But what makes it particularly worrying is the rapid fraying of the social contract that we see across these countries. We seem to be back in the Dickensian world of hard times, with haves facing off against the increasingly alienated have nots with no resolution in sight. Questions of economies and economic policy are central to the present crisis. Is there something that can be done to boost the growth? Should that even be a priority for the affluent West? And what else? What about exploding inequality everywhere? Is international trade the problem or the solution? What is its effects on inequality? What is the future on trade? Can countries with cheaper labor costs lure global manufacturing away from China? And what about migration? Is there really too much low skilled migration? What about new technologies? Should we, for example, worry about the rise of artificial intelligence or celebrate it? And perhaps most urgently, how can society help all those people the markets have left behind? The answers to these problems make more than a tweet. So there is an urge to just avoid them. And partly as a result, nations are doing very little to solve the most pressing challenges of our time. They continue to feed the anger and distrust that polarize us, which makes us even more incapable of talking, thinking together, doing something about them. It often feels like a vicious cycle. Economists have a lot to say about these big issues. They study immigration to see what it does to wages, taxes to determine if they discourage enterprise, redistribution to figure out whether it encourages sloth. They think about what happens when nations trade and have useful predictions about who the winner and losers are likely to be. What they have worked hard to understand, and why some nations grow and others don't, and what, if anything, governments can do to help. They gather data on what makes people generous or wary, what makes a man leave his home for a strange place, how social media plays on our prejudices. What the most recent research has to say, it turns out, is often surprising, especially to those who used to pat answers coming out of TV, economists, and high school textbooks. It can shed new light on those debates. Unfortunately, very few people trust economists enough to listen carefully to what they have to say. Right before the Brexit vote, our colleagues in the UK desperately tried to warn the public that Brexit would be costly, but they felt they were not getting through. They were right. No one was paying much attention. Early in 2017, YouGov conducted a poll in the UK in which they asked, of the following, whose opinion do you trust the most when they talk about their field of expertise? Nurses came first. 84% of people polled trusted them. Politicians came last at 5%, though local members of parliament were trusted a bit more at 20%. Economists were just above politicians at 25%. Trust in weather forecasts was twice as high. In the fall of 2018, we asked the same question, as well as several others about views on economic issues, which we make use of at various points in the book, to 10,000 people in the United States. There again, just 25% of people trusted economics about their own field of expertise. Only politicians ranked lower. This means economists often get things wrong. We will no doubt do so many times in this book. Not just about the growth rate, which is mostly a hopeless exercise, but also about somewhat more limited questions, like how much carbon taxes will help the climate change, how CEOs' pay might be affected if taxes were to be raised a lot, or what universal basic income would do to the structure of employment. But economists are not the only ones who make mistakes. Everyone gets things wrong. What is dangerous is not making mistakes, but to be so enamored of one's point of view that one does not let facts get in the way. To make progress, we have to constantly go back to the facts, acknowledge our errors, and move on. Besides, there is plenty of good economics around. Good economics starts with troubling facts. Make some guesses based on what we already know about human behavior and theories elsewhere shown to work. Uses the data to test those guesses, refines or radically alters its line of attack based on the new set of facts, and eventually, with some luck, gets to the solution. In this, our work is also a lot like medical research. Siddhartha Mukherjee's wonderful book on the fight against cancer, The Emperor of All Maladies, tells a story of combining inspired guesswork with a careful testing and many rounds of refinement before a new drug gets to the market. A big part of economists' work is very much like that. As in medicine, we are never sure we have reached the truth, just that we have enough faith in answer to act on it, knowing we may have to change our minds later. Also, like in medicine, our work does not stop once the basic science is done and the core idea is established. The process of rolling out the idea in the real world then begins. At one level, one could think of this book as a report from the trenches where the research happens. What does the best economics today tell us about the fundamental issues our societies are grappling with? We describe how today's best economists think about the world. not just their conclusions, but also how they got there, all the while trying to separate facts and pipe dreams, brave assumptions and solid results, what we hope for and what we know. It is important that in this project we be guided by an expansive notion of what human beings want and what constitutes the good life. Economists have a tendency to adopt a notion of well being that is often too narrow, some version of income or material consumption. And yet, all of us need much more than that to have a fulfilling life. The respect of the community, the comforts of family and friends, dignity, lightness, pleasure. The focus on income alone is not a convenient shortcut. It is a distorting lens that often has led the smart economists down the wrong path, policymakers to the wrong directions, and all too many of us to the wrong obsessions. It is not what persuades so many of us that the whole world is waiting at the door to take our well paying jobs. It is what has led to a single minded focus on restoring the Western nations to some glorious past of fast economic growth. It is what makes us simultaneously deeply suspicious of those who don't have money and terrified to find ourselves in their shoes. It is also what makes the trade off between the growth of the country and the survival of the planet seem so dark. A better conversation must start by acknowledging the deep human desire for dignity and human contact, and to treat it not as a distraction, but as a better way to understand each other and to set ourselves free from what appear to be intractable oppositions. Restoring human dignity to its central place, we argue in this book, sets off a profound rethinking of economic priorities and the ways in which societies care for their members, particularly when they are in need. That said, on any single issue we will cover in the book, or perhaps all of them, you may well come to a different conclusion than we do. We hope to persuade you not reflexively to argue with us, but to adopt a little bit of our methods and share some part of our hopes and fears. And perhaps by the end, we will really be talking to each other.